2,000 British children never met their Black American fathers. Here's why Liverpool Dock stretched endlessly along the Mersey River in May 1942, crowded with military vessels and cargo ships that brought the machinery of war to Britain's shores. Among the thousands of American soldiers disembarking that spring were men whose presence would challenge both nations in unexpected ways. These were African American troops, approximately 130,000 of them, arriving to join the fight against fascism in Europe while carrying the weight of their own nation's racial oppression on their shoulders. Private James Williams stepped onto British soil for the first time, his boots hitting the wet cobblestones of the dock with a sense of both purpose and uncertainty. He had left behind the Jim Crow South where he couldn't drink from the same water fountain as white Americans, couldn't sit in the front of a bus, couldn't vote in many places, and certainly couldn't look a white woman in the eye without risking his life. The segregated military he served in reflected these same brutal divisions. Black soldiers were assigned to separate units, ate in separate mess halls, slept in separate barracks, and were largely relegated to support roles rather than combat positions. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They were fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. What these soldiers found in Britain, however, was something they had never experienced in America. British civilians, while not entirely free of racial prejudice, had limited exposure to Black people before the war, and certainly had no legal framework of segregation. When white American officers attempted to impose the color bar in British pubs, dance halls, and public spaces, they met with resistance. The British government had issued a memo to local authorities warning them about American racial attitudes and advising them not to adopt these practices. Many British civilians simply refused to treat Black American soldiers as second-class citizens. This cultural collision created an environment where something remarkable could happen. In small towns and cities across England, from Manchester to Bristol, from London to rural villages, Black American soldiers began interacting with British civilians in ways that would have been impossible, even deadly, back home. They attended local dances, visited pubs, participated in community events, and were often welcomed into British homes. For many British women, these soldiers represented something beyond their role as allies in war. They were polite, respectful, and treated women with a courtesy that stood in stark contrast to some of the behavior they had witnessed from white American troops, who tried to enforce segregation on British soil. Mary Thompson was 22 years old when she first met James Williams at a dance hall in Manchester in the autumn of 1942. She worked in a munitions factory, part of the massive mobilization of British women into the war effort. Her father was fighting in North Africa, her brother in the Royal Navy. The war had upended every aspect of normal life, and the presence of American soldiers, both Black and white, added another layer of strangeness to an already transformed world. Mary had never spoken to a Black person before that night. Manchester, like most of Britain, had a tiny Black population before the war, concentrated mainly in port cities. What struck her first about James wasn't his race but his manners. He asked politely if he could have a dance, waited for her genuine consent, and spoke to her throughout the evening as an equal. He told her about his home in Alabama, about his family's small farm, about his mother who worked as a sea maid, and his father who sharecropped land they would never own. He told her about the fear that was a constant companion for Black people in the South, about the lynchings that went unpunished, about the daily humiliations that were simply accepted as the way things were. Mary listened with growing horror and incomprehension. She had known Britain had an empire, had known about colonies and racial hierarchies in distant places, but the systematic brutality James described seemed impossible in a modern nation, especially one that called itself a democracy. Their relationship developed over the following months, as did thousands of others across Britain. These weren't casual encounters or brief wartime flings, though some certainly were. Many were genuine connections between people who found in each other something they desperately needed during the chaos and uncertainty of war: companionship, understanding, hope. James and Mary met whenever his duties allowed. They walked through Manchester's parks, attended dances, went to the cinema, and gradually fell in love. They talked about the future, about what might happen after the war, about the possibility of marriage and a life together. But these relationships existed in a complicated and often hostile environment. White American soldiers, particularly those from the South, were outraged by what they saw as violations of the racial order they considered natural and necessary. Tensions escalated throughout 1942 and 1943. In June 1943, these tensions exploded in the Battle of Bamber Bridge, a small town in Lancashire. White American military police attempted to arrest black soldiers at a pub, claiming they were causing trouble. The reality was that the soldiers were simply socializing with local British civilians who had welcomed them. When the MPs tried to enforce segregation, the situation spiraled into violence. Shots were fired, one black soldier was killed, and several others were wounded. What made the Battle of Bamber Bridge significant wasn't just the violence but the response of British civilians. The townspeople sided with the black soldiers. Local pubs put up signs saying "Black troops only" in solidarity. British civilians testified on behalf of the soldiers, contradicting the official American military account. This incident crystallized what was happening across Britain: a rejection of American racial segregation and a relative acceptance of black soldiers that these men had never experienced in their own country. For James and Mary and couples like them, these broader tensions created constant pressure. Mary's mother was concerned about what the neighbors would say, about how a mixed-race grandchild would be treated, about whether Mary was throwing her life away. Some of Mary's friends stopped speaking to her. She lost her job at the munitions factory, though no official reason was given. James faced harassment from white American soldiers and warnings from his own officers that relationships with white women could lead to serious consequences, including court-martial for various invented offenses. Despite these obstacles, their relationship continued, and in early 1944, Mary discovered she was pregnant. She was terrified and elated in equal measure. James proposed marriage immediately. He wanted to do the right thing, wanted to be a father to his child, wanted to build a life with Mary. But this is where they encountered a wall of bureaucratic and legal obstacles that would prove insurmountable. The United States military actively discouraged marriages between American soldiers and foreign nationals during the war, requiring extensive paperwork, approval from commanding officers, and long waiting periods. For interracial marriages, these obstacles became nearly impossible barriers. In 1944, 30 states in America still had anti-miscegenation laws that made interracial marriage illegal. Even if James and Mary could navigate the military bureaucracy, they would face the reality that in much of America, their marriage would be void, their child illegitimate, and their family subject to violence and legal persecution. James filled out the paperwork anyway. He submitted requests for permission to marry. He wrote letters to his commanding officers explaining the situation. The responses were delays, denials, and demands for additional documentation. Months passed. Mary's pregnancy became visible. The whispers in her neighborhood became open hostility. Her mother begged her to give the baby up for adoption, to save herself from a life of shame and hardship. In March 1945, James's unit received orders to prepare for deployment to the Pacific Theater. The war in Europe was entering its final phase, and troops were being repositioned for the expected invasion of Japan. James was given 72 hours' notice. He spent every moment he could with Mary, now 7 months pregnant. He promised he would find a way to bring her to America, that he would send for her as soon as he could, that they would be together. He gave her every bit of money he had saved, an address for his parents in Alabama, and a promise that he would write as soon as he arrived at his new posting. Mary gave birth to a daughter in May 1945, just as the war in Europe ended. She named her Grace, hoping the name might bring some mercy into the child's life. Grace had her father's dark eyes and her mother's smile. She was beautiful, and Mary loved her with a fierce desperation that was mixed with terror about their future. James's letters stopped coming in June. Mary wrote to the address he had given her but received no response. She wrote to the military, but her letters went unanswered or were returned with stamps indicating the addressee could not be located. She had no way of knowing that James's unit had been shipped to the Philippines, that mail service was chaotic in the final months of the war, that the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August had suddenly ended the war and thrown military logistics into further confusion. She didn't know that James was desperately trying to find her, that his letters were sitting in a mail depot in Manila, that he had requested leave to return to Britain and been denied. What Mary did know was that she was alone with a mixed-race baby in a society that was not prepared to accept either of them. Post-war Britain was exhausted, economically devastated, and struggling to rebuild. Resources were scarce, housing was limited, and social services were overwhelmed. Single mothers faced severe stigma under any circumstances. Single mothers with mixed-race children faced something worse, a combination of moral judgment and racial prejudice that left them isolated and vulnerable. Mary's situation was replicated approximately 2,000 times across Britain. 2,000 women, give or take, found themselves raising mixed-race children whose fathers had returned to America. Some of these fathers knew about the pregnancies. Many didn't. Some tried desperately to maintain contact. Others were prevented by military orders, family pressure, or the simple impossibility of communication across the Atlantic in an era before easy international phone calls or internet. Some fathers were married men who had hidden their British relationships. Others were single men who genuinely wanted to be fathers, but were blocked by legal and bureaucratic barriers. The children born from these relationships became known as brown babies, a term that was sometimes affectionate, but more often carried undertones of otherness and problem. These babies represented a challenge to British society's understanding of itself. Britain had an empire that included millions of non-white subjects, but the British population itself was overwhelmingly white. Mixed-race children were rare, visible, and often unwelcome. Social workers and adoption agencies faced a dilemma they were ill-equipped to handle. The post-war years saw a high demand for adoptable babies from childless couples, but these couples wanted white babies. Agencies reported that mixed-race children were difficult to place or unadoptable in Britain. The language used in official documents and case files from this period is shocking in its casual racism. Children were described as too dark for British families. Social workers wrote that these children would face insurmountable prejudice and would be better off in institutions or adopted abroad. Mary faced increasing pressure from her mother, from social workers, and from the simple economic reality of trying to survive as a single mother in post-war Britain. Her mother told her daily that she was being selfish, that keeping Grace was condemning the child to a life of prejudice and hardship, that the kindest thing she could do was give her daughter a chance at a better life through adoption. Social workers echoed these sentiments, adding that Grace might be able to be placed with a Black American family if Mary was willing to allow her to be sent to the United States. The pressure was relentless and came from a place that mixed genuine concern with deep-seated racism. The underlying message was clear. Grace was too dark to be accepted in British society, too dark to be kept by her white mother, too dark to have a normal life in the only country she had ever known. This wasn't just about single motherhood or wartime circumstances. White single mothers faced stigma, but they weren't told their babies were the wrong color to keep. In the winter of 1946, after months of pressure and in the depths of despair, Mary made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She signed the papers to give Grace up for adoption. She was told that her daughter would be placed with a good family, possibly in America, possibly with people who looked like her father, possibly in a place where she wouldn't face the prejudice she would encounter in Britain. Mary held Grace one last time, memorizing every detail of her face, and then watched as a social worker carried her daughter away. Mary's story was repeated in various forms across Britain. Some mothers fought harder, managed to keep their children despite the pressure, and raised them in the face of considerable prejudice. Others, like Mary, succumbed to the combined weight of economic hardship, social pressure, and the genuine belief that they were doing what was best for their children. The tragedy is that this belief was shaped by a racist society that told these mothers their children were too dark to love, too dark to keep, too dark to belong. What happened to the children who were given up? The outcomes varied, but few were positive. Some were indeed sent to America for adoption by Black families, though these placements were complicated by the same racial dynamics that had separated them from their fathers in the first place. American adoption agencies in the 1940s were segregated, and placing mixed-race British children involved navigating both British and American bureaucracies, transatlantic travel in the immediate post-war period, and finding Black American families willing and able to adopt. Many children were never adopted at all. They grew up in children's homes and orphanages, institutions that were often grim places in post-war Britain. These children faced racism from staff and other children, grew up without family connections, and often had no information about their origins. Their birth certificates might list their mothers, but rarely their fathers. Many didn't know they had American fathers until they were adults, if they ever found out at all. Deborah Pryor was one of these children. Born in 1943 to a white British mother and a black American soldier, she was placed in a children's home when she was 6 months old. She grew up knowing she was different, facing racist taunts and isolation but having no information about her father. The home kept minimal records, and what records existed were often inaccurate or incomplete. Deborah spent her childhood and adolescence wondering who her father was, where he came from, whether he knew she existed, whether he ever thought about her. It wasn't until she was in her 60s in the 2000s that Deborah was able to use DNA testing and genealogical research to trace her father's family. She discovered that her father, whose name was Edward, had returned to America after the war, had married, had other children, and had died in 1995. He had never known that Deborah existed. Her mother had never been able to contact him, and he had never known about the pregnancy. Deborah found half-siblings who were shocked to learn of her existence but welcomed her into the family. She finally had answers, but they came too late. She would never meet her father, never hear his voice, never ask him the questions that had haunted her entire life. Lloyd Jobson had a similar experience. Born in 1944, he was adopted by a white British family who loved him but couldn't protect him from the racism he faced growing up in 1950s Britain. He always knew he was adopted and that his father had been an American soldier, but he had no details. In his 70s, he began researching and eventually found his father's family in North Carolina. His father, like Deborah's, had died years earlier without knowing he had a son in Britain. Lloyd discovered that his father had tried to find his mother after the war, had written letters that were never delivered, had asked the military for help, and been told there was nothing they could do. These stories of near misses and lost connections are heartbreaking in their specificity, but representative of a broader tragedy. 2,000 children grew up without their fathers, and most of those fathers never knew these children existed. The separation wasn't a matter of choice or abandonment in most cases. It was the result of systematic barriers erected by racism, bureaucracy, and social prejudice. Why did these children never meet their fathers? The answer is complex and involves multiple intersecting factors, each of which would have been difficult to overcome individually, and which together created an insurmountable barrier. First, there were the military orders that moved soldiers rapidly and without regard for personal circumstances. The military in 1945 was demobilizing millions of men, repositioning troops from Europe to the Pacific, and then suddenly dealing with the end of the war and the need to bring everyone home. Individual soldiers had no control over their movements, no ability to delay orders, and limited means of communication. When James Williams was shipped to the Philippines with 72 hours' notice, he had no way to stay in contact with Mary. Mail service was unreliable, letters were lost, and by the time the war ended and mail service normalized, Mary had moved from her old address, and James had no way to find her. Second, there were the legal barriers that made interracial marriage nearly impossible. The War Brides Act of 1945 allowed approximately 70,000 British women to join their American husbands in the United States, but this act was complicated by anti-miscegenation laws. Women married to black soldiers faced the reality that their marriages might not be recognized in many American states, that they might face violence and legal persecution, and that their children would be illegitimate in the eyes of the law. The military bureaucracy reflected these legal realities, making it extremely difficult for black soldiers to get permission to marry foreign nationals. Third, there were the bureaucratic obstacles that prevented communication and contact. Soldiers who wanted to find their British girlfriends or the mothers of their children had to navigate a system that was indifferent at best and actively obstructive at worst. The military had no mechanism for helping soldiers maintain contact with foreign nationals who weren't legal wives. Letters were lost or undelivered. Requests for information were denied. The Red Cross and other organizations that helped reunite families focused on legal marriages and legitimate children, categories that excluded most of these relationships. Fourth, there was the social stigma that pushed mothers into silence. Women like Mary faced enormous pressure to hide their shame, to give up their children, to move on and pretend it never happened. Many mothers never told their families the full story, never kept records, and took the secrets to their graves. This silence made it impossible for children to search for their fathers even when they wanted to. Without a name, a unit designation, or any identifying information, how could they possibly find one man among the 130,000 black soldiers who had been in Britain? Fifth, There was the adoption system that deliberately erased identities and severed connections. Adoption in the 1940s and 1950s was designed to create a clean break between birth families and adoptive families. Records were sealed, birth certificates were amended, and children were often given no information about their origins. This was considered best practice at the time, based on the theory that children would bond better with adoptive families if they had no connection to their birth families. For the Brown babies, this meant that even the basic information about their fathers was often lost or hidden. Sixth, and perhaps most fundamentally, there was the racism that deemed these children too dark to keep, too dark to belong, too dark to matter. This racism operated at every level: in the families that pressured mothers to give up their babies, in the social workers who told mothers they were being selfish to keep children who would face prejudice, in the adoption agencies that couldn't place mixed-race children, in the society that made it clear these children were unwelcome. The separation of these children from their fathers and often from their mothers was rooted in the belief that racial mixing was wrong, that these children were problems to be solved rather than people to be loved. The human cost of these separations is incalculable. 2,000 children grew up without fathers, and most without any connection to their paternal heritage. They faced racism in Britain without the support of families who understood their experience. They struggled with identity, belonging, and the fundamental question of who they were and where they came from. Many spent their entire lives searching for answers that came too late, or never came at all. The fathers, too, paid a price. Many never knew they had children, never had the chance to be fathers, never knew that somewhere across the Atlantic was a son or daughter who looked like them and wondered about them. Some fathers did know and spent years trying to find their children, writing letters that went unanswered, making inquiries that led nowhere, carrying the grief of separation and the guilt of abandonment, even though the abandonment wasn't their choice. The mothers who gave up their children carried lifelong trauma. Mary never had other children, never married, and spent the rest of her life wondering what had happened to Grace. She died in 1987 without ever knowing that Grace had been adopted by a family in Birmingham, had grown up to become a teacher, had married, and had children of her own, and had spent years searching for the mother who had given her up and the father she had never known. These stories began to emerge publicly in the 1980s and 1990s as the Brown babies, now middle-aged adults, began speaking out about their experiences and searching for their origins. Documentaries were made, research was conducted, and support groups were formed. The advent of DNA testing in the 2000s made it possible for some to find their fathers' families, though by then, most of the fathers themselves had died. Carol Travers was one of the more fortunate ones. Born in 1944, she was raised by her white British mother, who kept her despite enormous pressure to give her up. Her mother told her about her father, an American soldier named John, but had limited information. In 2010, using DNA testing and genealogical research, Carol found her father's family in New Jersey. Her father had died in 2008, just 2 years before she found them, but she was able to meet her half-siblings, see photographs of her father, and learn about the man whose absence had shaped her entire life. Her half-siblings told her that their father had spoken occasionally about a woman he had known in England during the war, but he had never mentioned a child. He hadn't known. The broader historical context of this story reveals the intersection of race, war, and social policy in ways that are both specific to this moment and reflective of longer patterns. The presence of Black American soldiers in Britain during World War II created a unique situation where the racial dynamics of two different societies collided. American segregation met British class structure and relative racial openness. The result was a brief window where interracial relationships were possible in ways they weren't in America, but the children of those relationships fell through the cracks of both societies. The treatment of the Brown babies reflects how racism shaped adoption and family policy in the post-war period. The idea that children were too dark to be placed with white families, that they would be better off separated from their white mothers, that they were essentially unadoptable in Britain, reveals the extent to which racial prejudice was embedded in social welfare systems. These weren't just individual acts of discrimination, but systematic policies that treated mixed-race children as problems, rather than as children who deserved families and belonging. The story also reveals the cost of segregation and discriminatory laws. The anti-miscegenation laws that made interracial marriage illegal in much of America didn't just affect couples in the United States. They reached across the Atlantic to separate families, to prevent fathers from knowing their children, to create a generation of people who grew up without half of their heritage. These laws, which weren't fully struck down until the Supreme Court's Loving v. Virginia decision in 1967, had consequences that extended far beyond American borders. The brown babies represent a forgotten casualty of World War II. When we think about the war's impact, we think about the soldiers who died, the civilians who were bombed, the Holocaust, the atomic bombs, the redrawing of national borders. We don't often think about the children born from wartime relationships, the families that were separated by military orders and legal barriers, the people who spent their lives searching for connections that were severed before they were born. Today, the surviving brown babies are in their 70s and 80s. Some have found their fathers' families through DNA testing and genealogical research. Others are still searching, still hoping to find answers before it's too late. Organizations like the Merseyside Maritime Museum in Liverpool have created exhibits about the brown babies, preserving their stories and acknowledging this hidden chapter of history. Researchers have documented the experiences of these children and their families, ensuring that their stories aren't lost. What can we learn from this history? First, that racism has multi-generational impacts that extend far beyond the immediate victims. The segregation and discrimination that Black American soldiers faced, the anti-miscegenation laws that prevented them from marrying the women they loved, the adoption policies that deemed mixed-race children unadoptable, all of these created trauma that affected not just individuals but families and communities across generations. Second, that bureaucratic systems can be instruments of oppression even when individual actors within those systems believe they are helping. The social workers who pressured mothers to give up their children, the adoption agencies that couldn't place mixed-race children, the military bureaucrats who denied marriage permissions and lost letters. Many of these people probably believed they were doing their jobs or even helping, but the systems they operated within were shaped by racism, and the outcomes were devastating. Third, that the human cost of discriminatory laws and policies is real and lasting. The 2,000 children who never met their fathers aren't just statistics. They are people like Deborah Pryor, Lloyd Jobson, and Carol Travers, who spent their lives searching for identity and belonging, who faced racism and isolation, who were denied the fundamental human connection to their fathers not because their fathers didn't want them, but because society deemed their existence problematic. Fourth, that stories matter. For decades, the brown babies were invisible in historical accounts of World War II. Their experiences weren't taught in schools, weren't included in documentaries, weren't acknowledged in official histories. It was only when they began telling their own stories, demanding recognition and searching for their origins that this history began to be acknowledged. Their persistence in claiming their stories and their identities is itself a form of resistance against the erasure that racism attempted to impose. The story of the 2,000 British children who never met their Black American fathers is ultimately a story about the enduring question of, what if? What if the military had allowed soldiers to maintain contact with their British families? What if anti-miscegenation laws hadn't made interracial marriage illegal? What if adoption agencies had worked to place mixed-race children with families instead of deeming them unadoptable? What if society had welcomed these children instead of treating them as too dark to keep? What if these fathers had known their children existed? These questions can't be answered, and the past can't be changed. But acknowledging this history, understanding how racism shaped these outcomes, and recognizing the humanity of the people involved is essential. The brown babies and their families deserve to have their stories told, their experiences validated, and their place in history recognized. They are a reminder that the fight for racial justice isn't just about laws and policies, but about families, identities, and the fundamental human right to know where you come from and to be loved, regardless of the color of your skin. 2,000 children never met their fathers because racism, in its many forms, stood between them. That is the simple and devastating truth of this story. It's a truth that echoes across generations and reminds us that the work of dismantling racism and its legacies is ongoing and urgent. These children, now elderly adults, spent their lives navigating the consequences of decisions made by others, of systems designed to keep people apart, of a world that told them they were too dark to belong. Their stories are a testament to resilience, to the human need for connection and identity, and to the enduring cost of prejudice and discrimination. If you found this story as powerful and heartbreaking as we did, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you untold stories from history that deserve to be remembered and shared. These aren't just facts and dates. They're real people whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, and their stories matter. Hit that like button if this video moved you or taught you something new about this hidden chapter of World War II history. Your likes help us reach more people who need to hear these important stories, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Did you know about the brown babies before watching this video? Your voice mattered to this community. Share this video with someone who loves history, who cares about social justice, or who simply needs to understand how racism's impact echoes across generations. Together, we can make sure these 2,000 children and their families are never forgotten again. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.